Hi, I'm Tom Groening, editor of the Working Waterfront newspaper and workingwaterfront.com. And this month in our ongoing series of Q&A interviews, we feature Colin Woodard. Now, if you don't know who Colin Woodard is, you ought to, because he's becoming one of Maine's preeminent journalists, writers, and thinkers. He's probably best known for being the author of The Lobster Coast, The Republic of Pirates, which will be made into a TV show this fall on NBC, and American Nations. We sat down with him at the Samoset Resort in Rockport in early May, and he spoke a lot about Maine's heritage as a former colony of Massachusetts.
I think politicians or anyone else should be aware that the Maine coast is extremely unusual and unique, really, in the United States, in that it was settled very early. I mean, the 1620s in York County, working up to the 1760s as you get into Hancock and Washington County, sort of spectrum of settlement. And unlike other places settled that early, it suffered a dramatic economic collapse after the Civil War in our case, which meant that we essentially missed on the coast all the great 19th century waves of immigration. You know, there were no jobs here. People were fleeing coastal Maine. Yes, they went to the interior, to the mill towns and stuff, but coastal Maine largely missed out. And the effect is that for 400 years or 250 years, the same people and families who settled those towns often remained in place on the same land their families had originally been granted all the way up through the 1980s, and in some cases still today, although there's been a big change. And that's meant that one of the defining characteristics of the Maine coast that is reflected because of the population and stuff on the state as a whole is this sort of almost European sense of that one's bloodline and a place and its history are tied together, that there's almost that sense of nationhood, if you will, that carries with it all those attendant feelings about outsiders coming in large numbers from a different culture and sort of taking over the land and the institutions. You almost get that colonial effect where the people who are being colonized, and that explains a lot of the dynamics you see in the native versus from away dynamics that play out in many small towns, and I'm certain on the islands probably even more so. Because we have that subculture, and there are all sorts of resentments that are tied to the forgotten period where we were a colony of Massachusetts. And therefore there are a lot of aggravations and knee-jerk reactions to Massachusetts and things from Massachusetts and ideas coming in. And that it's unfortunate in the sense that Massachusetts and Greater Boston are also the economic hub from which most activity, like concentric circles, reaches outwards into Maine. The closer you are to Boston, the wealthier the places are. And if you at the same time have this sort of cultural hostility that's historically based and based on real bad things that happened in our deep history that are sort of forgotten, but the emotions are still there, that does sort of grate against the hub of the economy at the same time. So it kind of puts us in an odd position that way. There's also, because of that long colonial period, I think many of us in Maine, there's this idea that somehow if it's grown in Maine, it's from Maine, somewhere in the psyche there's this idea that it's second rate, which is totally untrue, but it's a curse of that idea that, if people they aren't really respected within Maine until they've gone out and been embraced in Boston and New York and then come back, whether it's in music or the arts or what have you. It's somehow, if it's just grown in Maine, it's not embraced yet because the outside world hasn't embraced it. That's a strange thing. The idea that the lack of self-confidence that, again, comes from being essentially a colonial people, a post-colonial society. And that affects people all over the world, but I don't think people quite realize that Maine's a post-colonial society, and that explains many of those things and sort of our pathology of feeling like we're, not first-rate, top-shelf. If you're raised in Maine and you do things in Maine and you haven't been elsewhere, that somehow doesn't count as much, which is totally untrue. And I think that's probably the biggest way in which that inhibits us.